Finney Systematic Theology, Chapter 2, continued under moral obligation, beginning with free will. Moral agency implies the possession of free will. By free will is intended the power of choosing or refusing to choose, in every instance, in compliance with moral obligation. Free will implies the power of originating and deciding our own choices, and of exercising our own sovereignty in every instance of choice upon moral questions, of deciding or choosing in conformity with duty or otherwise in all cases of moral obligation. That man cannot be under a moral obligation to perform an absolute impossibility is a first truth of reason. But man's causality, his whole power of causality to perform or do anything, lies in his will. If he cannot will, he can do nothing. His whole liberty or freedom must consist in his power to will. His outward actions and his mental states are connected with the actions of his will by a law of necessity. If I will to move my muscles, they must move, unless there be a paralysis of the nerves of voluntary motion, or unless some resistance be opposed that overcomes the power of my volitions. The sequences of choice or volition are always under the law of necessity, and unless the will is free, man has no freedom. And if he has no freedom, he is not a moral agent. That is, he is incapable of moral action and also of moral character. Free will, then, in the above defined sense, must be a condition of moral agency and, of course, of moral obligation. As consciousness gives the rational affirmation that necessity is an attribute of the affirmations of the reason and of the states of sensibility, so it just as unequivocally gives the reason's affirmations that liberty is an attribute of the actions of the will. I am as conscious of the affirmation that I could will differently from what I do in every instance of moral obligation, as I am of the affirmation that I cannot affirm, in regard to truths of intuition, otherwise than I do. I am as conscious of affirming that I am free in willing as I am of affirming that I am not free or voluntary in my feelings and intuitions. Consciousness of affirming the freedom of the will, that is, of power to will in accordance with moral obligation, or to refuse thus to will, is a necessary condition of the affirmation of obligation. For example, no man affirms or can affirm his obligation to undo all the acts of his past life and to live his life over again. He cannot affirm himself to be under this obligation simply because he cannot but affirm the impossibility of it. He cannot but affirm his obligation to repent and obey God in future because he is conscious of affirming his ability to do this. Consciousness of the affirmation of ability to comply with any requisition is a necessary condition of the affirmation of obligation to comply with that requisition. Then no moral agent can affirm himself to be under obligation to perform an impossibility. 2. A second condition of moral obligation is light, or so much knowledge of our moral relations as to develop the idea of oughtness. This implies 1. The perception or idea of the intrinsically valuable. 2. The affirmation of obligation to will the valuable for its own sake. Before I can affirm my obligation to will, I must perceive something in that which I am required to will as an ultimate end that renders it worthy of being chosen. I must have an object of choice. That object must possess in itself that which commends itself to my intelligence as worthy of being chosen. All choice must respect means or ends. That is, everything must be willed either as an end or a means. I cannot be under obligation to will the means until I know the end. I cannot know the end, or that which can possibly be chosen as an ultimate end, until I know that something is intrinsically valuable. I cannot know that it is right or wrong to choose or refuse a certain end until I know whether the proposed object of choice is intrinsically valuable or not. It is impossible for me to choose it as an ultimate end unless I perceive it to be intrinsically valuable. This is self-evident, for choosing it as an end is nothing else than choosing it for its intrinsic value. Moral obligation, therefore, always and necessarily implies the knowledge that the well-being of God and of the universe is valuable in itself, and the affirmation that it ought to be chosen for its own sake, that is, impartially and on account of its intrinsic value. It is impossible that the idea of right and wrong should be developed until the idea of the valuable is developed. Right and wrong respect intentions, and strictly nothing else, as we shall see. Intention implies an end intended. Now, that which is chosen as an ultimate end is and must be chosen for its own sake or for its intrinsic value. Until the end is apprehended, no idea or affirmation of obligation can exist respecting it. Consequently, no idea of right or wrong in respect to that end can exist. The end must first be perceived. The idea of the intrinsically valuable must be developed. Simultaneously with the development of the idea of the valuable, the intelligence affirms and must affirm obligation to will it, or, which is strictly speaking the same thing, that it is right to will it and wrong not to will it. It is impossible that the idea of moral obligation or of right and wrong should be developed upon any other conditions than those just specified. Suppose, for instance, that it should be said that the idea of the intrinsically valuable is not necessary to the development of the idea of moral obligation and of right and wrong. Let us look at it. It is agreed that moral obligation and the ideas of right and wrong respect, directly, intentions only. It is also admitted that all intentions must respect either means or ends. It is also admitted that obligation to will means cannot exist until the end is known. It is also admitted that the choice of an ultimate end implies the choice of a thing for its own sake, or because it is intrinsically valuable. Now, from these admissions, it follows that the idea of the intrinsically valuable is the condition of moral obligation, and also of the idea of moral obligation. It must follow also that the idea of the valuable must be the condition of the idea that it would be right to choose or wrong not to choose the valuable. It is then nonsense to affirm that the ideas of right and wrong are developed antecedently to the idea of the valuable. It is the same as to say that I affirm it to be right to will an end before I have the idea of an end, or wrong not to will an end when as yet I have no idea or knowledge of any reason why it should be willed, or, in other words, while I have no idea of an ultimate end. Let it be distinctly understood, then, that the conditions of moral obligation in the universal form of obligation to will the highest well-being of God and of the universe for its own sake are the possession of the powers or faculties and susceptibilities of a moral agent and light or the development of the ideas of the valuable, of moral obligation, of right and wrong. I have defined the conditions of obligation in its universal form, i.e., obligation to be benevolent, to love God and our neighbor, or to will the universal good of being for its intrinsic value. Obligation in this form is universal and always a unit, and has always the same conditions. But there are myriads of specific forms of obligation which relate to the conditions and means of securing this ultimate end. We shall have occasion hereafter fully to show that obligation respects three classes of the will's actions, viz., the choice of an ultimate end, the choice of the conditions and means of securing that end, and executive volitions or efforts to put forth to secure the end. I have already shown that moral agency, with all that is implied in it, has the universal conditions of obligation to choose the highest good of well-being as an ultimate end. This must be self-evident. Obligation to choose the conditions of this end, the holiness of God and of all moral agents, for example, must be conditioned upon the perception that these are the conditions. In other words, the perception of the relation of these means to the end must be a condition of the obligation to will their existence. The perception of the relation is not the ground, but simply the condition of obligation in this form. The relation of holiness to happiness as a condition of its existence could not impose obligation to will the existence of holiness without reference to the intrinsic value of happiness as the fundamental reason for willing it as a necessary condition and means. The ground of the obligation to will the existence of holiness as a means of happiness is the intrinsic value of happiness, but the perceived relation of holiness to happiness is a condition of the obligation. But for this perceived relation, the obligation could not exist, yet the perceived relation could not create the obligation. Suppose that holiness is the means of happiness, yet no obligation to will holiness on account of this relation could exist but for the intrinsic value of happiness. Conditions of obligation to put forth executive acts. Having now defined the conditions of obligation in its universal form, and also in the form of obligation to choose the existence of holiness as a necessary means of happiness, I now proceed to point out the conditions of obligation to put forth executive volitions or efforts to secure holiness and secure the highest good of being. Our busy lives are made up in efforts to secure some ultimate end upon which the heart is set. The sense in which obligation extends to these executive volitions or acts I shall soon consider. At present, I am concerned only to define the conditions of these forms of obligation. These forms of obligation, be it understood, respect volitions and consequent outward acts. Volitions, designed as executive acts, always suppose an existing choice of the end designed to be secured by them. Obligation to put forth executive efforts to secure an end must be conditioned upon the possibility, supposed necessity, and utility of such efforts. If the end chosen does not need to be promoted by any efforts of ours, or if such efforts are impossible to us, or if they are seen to be of no use, there can be no obligation to make them. It is important, however, to observe that the utility of ultimate choice, or the choice of an object for its own sake, is not a condition of obligation in that form. Ultimate choice, or the choice of an object for its own sake, or for its intrinsic value, is not an effort designed to secure or obtain that object, that is not put forth with any such design. When the object, which the mind perceives to be intrinsically valuable, as the good of being, for example, is perceived by the mind, it cannot but choose or refuse it. Indifference in this case is naturally impossible. The mind in such circumstances is under a necessity of choosing one way or the other. The will must embrace or reject it. The reason affirms the obligation to choose the intrinsically valuable for its own sake, and not because choosing it will secure it. Nor does the real choice of it imply a purpose or an obligation to put forth executive acts to secure it, except upon condition that such acts are seen to be necessary and possible and calculated to secure it. Ultimate choice is not put forth with design to secure its object. It is only the will's embracing the object or willing it for its own sake. In regard to ultimate choice, the will must choose or refuse the object entirely irrespectively of the tendency of the choice to secure the object. Assuming this necessity, the reason affirms that it is right, fit, suitable, or, which is the same thing, that the will ought or is under obligation to choose the good or valuable and not refuse it because of its intrinsic nature, and without regard to whether the choosing will secure the object chosen. But executive acts, be it remembered, are and must be put forth with design to secure their object, and of course cannot exist unless the design exists, and the design cannot exist unless the mind assumes the possibility, necessity, and utility of such efforts.